trees. So kind of up front, we'll revisit these later. One of the things that I think emerald ash borer taught us is, as woodland owners, we all need to be a little more proactive than reactive. Do some things before the pest gets here if we're looking at another invasive pest. Know your woods. I mean, one of the things for me was I knew the woods and I knew we had a lot of ash, but I didn't have a good handle on how much ash was there until we started using it as an example as we wrote fact sheets and tried to make recommendations for other woodland owners across the state. You need to know what those goals and objectives are because you're trying to accomplish those, and we want to be able to put the right practices in place to move you down the path of being able to meet those goals and objectives. And it really doesn't hurt to get, really up close and personal with your woodland and know more about your woods. I will harp on this probably a couple times tonight, but species diversity matters. When emerald ash borer came in, I had sections of the woods, and you'll see this in a few minutes, that were better than 60% ash made up of the composition. And so when you lose that ash, you have little to nothing to work with. And so the more diverse you can make your stand, maybe with some thinnings or some plantings or some other things we'll talk about, it's crucial to have a diverse population of species, because if one thing comes in and knocks it out of your stand, you don't lose the integrity of your woodland, you just lose a small chunk of the woodland, and hopefully just a small chunk. We'll talk more about appropriate management strategies here and how you can get some help as we get to the end of this. But you need to kind of think about it, and don't be afraid, because it's not like someone's going to say to you, man, you got to be out in the woods every day and you got to do this and you got to do that. There's things that you can do that will improve the health of the forest. But it's not like it has to be an intensive, depending on what your woods looks like now, but you can take it in chunks. I always hate to see woodland owners try to tackle everything at once, feel like they don't make improvements, and then kind of give up and walk away. So you take it in little chunks and you do what you can when you can, and work with the woods as it changes, because it's never going to stay static. And there's professional foresters out there, and we will talk a little bit about those here at the end. But there's help out there. Ask us. That's what all of us went into the profession for. And we want to help you have a successful interaction with your woods, no matter what that may deal with. So what do you have, or what did you have if you're dealing with a woods now that has lost all of its ash? If ash was less than 20% of the stand, you can almost think of emerald ash borer having done a thinning in your stand and opened it up for the other species to grow better. Where we have issues typically is where it was greater than 20%, and how much was it, and what kind of opening, what kind of gaps do you now have to deal with, because that then brings in the invasive species side of things. Know the tree species and even the shrub species, and if you really want to get into the ground fauna, spring wildflowers and other things that are growing on the ground. I have a wonderful section of the woods that's ground cover is solid poison ivy, and that's not something I want to keep, but it's going to be a hard one to deal with. Pay attention to your trees. What do they look like? Crowns that are full and healthy and green, or thinning and looking like maybe there's some issues? Don't be afraid to ask. All of us have said, when a pest comes in or a disease comes in, we'd rather have you ask. Send me pictures, send any of us pictures, and we'll try to help you where we can, especially now where most of us aren't making field visits like we used to. And then the invasive species. The earlier you can get a handle on what, if any, you have growing in the woods, the better off you're going to be, because you can tackle them early before it's a solid understory of something that you don't want. It's a whole lot easier if it's an occasional plant that you can go after. So here's a result of emerald ash borer. The light patches that you see on here are from the woodpeckers that went after the larvae for emerald ash borer. And then a couple years ago, as we were doing a class in the woods at OSU Mansfield, I came up on this ash with these fungi, you know, emerging from those D-shaped exit holes, which just are telling us that the decay process is ongoing in the tree. And it's something to be a little concerned with. No matter what you see, this tells you that the tree is decaying and starting to come apart in some shape or form. So it's something as a woodland manager, if this is by a trail, this needs to be on the ground. If this is someplace where somebody camps, it needs to be on the ground. Timber-wise, you would have liked to have gotten to it several years prior to this. By the time you hit this point, you've probably had enough decay inside. You might be able to shave some of it off the edges and get a smaller cant if you tried to do it yourself. But for the most part, this one has lost the majority of its dollar value. And then sometimes you'll see this as you're trying to get familiar with your woods, and you come up on this, and this is kind of startling. It's, why does this tree look this way? This is just one of those things that happens with insects, usually mites of some sort, that create these deformities. Doesn't mean the tree is dying, doesn't mean anything other than you had the right tree with the right insect that created this growth that looks a little weird. But you need to know that. Those are the kind of things as a woodland owner you need to kind of pay attention to. Nothing to worry about, but I do have some things. If it occurs annually for multiple years, then you might need to look at, you know, what's going on. Is there something you can do to improve the health and not see this again? And the same thing here. So these are mites as well on some ash leaves. Look bad, but not something that you really have to be concerned with. There's a lot of things that go on with our trees that may catch your attention, and it's good to notice them, but it's not necessarily something that's going to dictate your management. But you also need to know what species of trees you're looking at, because sometimes it can be worse on one species versus another. So to test some of that knowledge, kind of ask yourself, what is this plant? And is this normal for the plant? And that's something that I would advise you as you get used to walking through your woods and looking at things and trying to make some management decisions. Is something unusual? Have you seen this before? Is it okay that it looks this way? Well, this is actually American beech, and this is beech leaf disease. So it's not normal. This is another one of those that we don't have a lot of answers for yet, but you can see these dark ribbons between the veins. They get to be almost hard, and in some places, eventually the tree is ending up dead. So it's in Northeast Ohio. It's being monitored, and we're looking more and more, but we don't have a lot of good answers. There's some nematodes they've found. We don't know exactly how they play in this issue with the trees. There's some bacteria that's been found on root systems. So it's still a learning process for all of this. But this is something that if you're a landowner with a woods that's heavily beech, and maybe you're managing beech for wildlife, for the beech seeds, the beech nuts, then you need to be paying attention to the leaves and notify somebody when and if you find this. This is something that I'm not certain we can manage our way out of, but we need to be paying attention to it to see where it is and how each site is different, to see what we can learn. And then there's these lovely little guys that usually just freak people out. A lot of folks nickname them the boogie woogie aphids. They're on beech, and when you walk up to them, as you can see, they kind of wiggle and squirm to try to scare you off as the predator they feel like you are. I had a landowner call me a couple years ago when these were really heavy in her woods, and she was just terrified that, you know, all of her beech trees were going to die. This is something that just occurs. They come in cycles. It's not something that you have to worry about, but it is something to pay attention to know that it's there. If you're walking through your woods and you see something like this, again, just like we talked about with the ash tree, this is an indicator that inside this tree, there's a boatload of decay going on. By the time you see an external structure like this, then there's been decay going on in this tree for years. We don't know how extensive it is, but usually by the time you see this on the outside, the inside has been pretty well ravaged with a decay issue. So again, where is that tree in your woods? If it comes down, what does it do? Does it damage a structure? Does it fall across a trail where folks horseback ride or something? These are all those kind of management things that we have to think about that don't always hit our radar screen probably like they should. So here's another one that is here in Morrow County because I have it in the backyard and in extensive areas in the woods. So the plant is a viburnum, and there's multiple different species of viburnum, and the insect feeding is not normal. It is from viburnum leaf beetle, which is this little guy here. So the adults feed on the surface of the leaf and the larvae feed on the underside of the leaf. There's some viburnum that they prefer over others. So this goes to if you're managing for wildlife and you're trying to encourage an understory of shrubs, you know, to provide you with a food source for different wildlife species. You need to know which viburnum are more susceptible than others and maybe come in and plant some diversity in order to maintain that growing stock for wildlife if that's something that you're focused on. And then we see these, which are horned oak galls. So typically we talk about they don't necessarily damage the tree until they get to be a very large population. And I will point out, if you're wondering, so this was cicada damage from the year previous to me taking these gall photos. So there's a lot of galls on oaks. They can look unsightly, but unless the tree really becomes engulfed in a large population of them, they're not a huge forest health issue. But it might be something that if you're managing for timber and this tree is well engulfed with galls and you're seeing some decline in the health, that you might think about if you're going to harvest, then maybe this is something that you take out. All sorts of different galls. This is just one that encompasses the entire twig and can look kind of nasty with all those thorns. So deadwood. Marnie Tichenall is our wildlife specialist and is going to be doing a webinar here in December on downed wood for wildlife. You can see that they've been hacking at this, and I know a lot of times woodland owners, you know, they try to cut up everything and not leave things on the ground. This needs to be part of your woodland management thought process, because while the wildlife are utilizing this dead log, it's also starting to decay and put nutrients back into the soil. And so it's a way of regenerating some nutrients that a lot of our forest soils could use a little bit more of. And for wildlife, it becomes a food source. This is a pileated woodpecker that I had at the edge of the yard a few years ago. And he just was having a glory day trying to find food in that downed log, and worked his way pretty much up and down that log for quite a while trying to find food. So some of the things we don't think about is why that down log has some importance to some of us. Other things you'll see, again, some woodpecker damage, but again, they're going after the lovely insects that are inside this dying tree. Some odd growths on beech, but when we checked these trees, they didn't have beech leaf disease, but they did have these odd growths that we looked at, but nobody really came up with a good conclusion about what was going on. But we talked about perhaps we take this tree out in case it is something, because if you look back here, there are some spots on this other beech, but not nearly as bad. And so maybe removing this one removes some inoculum of something that's going on that none of us were knowing what it was, and removing it from the stand so that it can't spread. Grapevines. So grapevines are a wonderful way for a forester and a wildlife person to have an argument in the woods. So grapevines provide some great wildlife habitat. If you are into birds, and cerulean warblers use strips of bark from grapevines to build their nests. So it's a part of their ecosystem. If you're managing for timber, you don't want grapevines growing up in this tree that may have some great dollar value to you. So a lot of times foresters will say, go through and cut every grapevine. My argument would be cut every grapevine on a tree that is going to help you meet your goals and objectives. So if a grapevine's growing up an elm or an ash, that's probably never going to amount to much, and neither are great sources of wildlife habitat. You could leave the grapevines for wildlife in those trees, but the red oak or the white oak or a hickory or something else that you're managing for, it's worth your time and effort to cut those vines so that they don't damage those trees. So there's some decisions there that feed into those management goals and objectives. For me, oaks are a great timber product, but they're also an awesome wildlife food source. And so when I have grapevines growing up an oak, the vine gets cut because that oak provides multiple benefits towards my goals and objectives than just the vine would itself. So things that you have to kind of weigh and balance and figure out what fits best for you. There's a good time of the year and a bad time of the year if you're going to treat vines. So you can always cut them if you've got a good cover and not a lot of sunlight that can get to them. A lot of times you can get away with just cutting them and not having to use an herbicide to try to kill them. But if you're in a young forest that doesn't have a lot of dense canopy and they can get enough sunlight, you can cut them, but then they'll just resprout. And so again, there's some decisions there that you have to make, what it is in your woods that you're trying to accomplish, and how extensive you want to work on the grapevines. So here's your invasive species test. There's a nice listing here of just a handful, and think about, what do we have? If you're in my territory and into Lexington, there are huge groves of this showy fly honeysuckle shrub. And this picture actually came from not too far away. Calorie pear has definitely escaped our landscapes and is coming up all over the place. There's a couple of different buckthorns. There's common and glossy. There are two different types of bittersweet. So there's American bittersweet and there's Oriental bittersweet. Oriental is the invasive one and the one that grows almost like kudzu. It can grow 6 to 10 feet a year. Autumn olive is definitely around here. In fact, right now when the wind blows and you see a shrub that has a silvery look as the leaves are turning, is usually autumn olive. And it's one of those I know will continue to come in because there's a field just about a road north of me that is an abandoned little field that's solid autumn olive. So I know where my seed source is. Garlic mustard, I mean, a lot of us have it. Probably the one you haven't thought about is the burning bush. Right now they're brilliant red and everybody loves to have them in the landscape. Unfortunately, they're becoming the new bush honeysuckle in the understory of our woods. So as I stood in the sugar bush on the Mansfield campus the other day, I kind of looked out over the 19-acre woodlot that we're working in, and you can see all that green. So as you familiarize yourself with your woods, and it's like, oh, I got some awesome red oak and white oak over here, but what's all that green over there? Well, unfortunately, in this case, that's all multiflora rose. And so it's small, it's kind of scraggly because it doesn't have full sun, but it's also increasing in size and scope. And so for me as a woodland owner, that's going up higher on my to-do list because I want to deal with multiflora rose before it gets to be a huge patch. I mean, it's bad enough to walk through now. And if you're going to cut trees, whether it's an intermediate cut or a timber sale, you're going to open up the canopy. And when this plant gets more sun, it just explodes. And so, and that's the way for most of these invasive species. So before you open up the canopy with some kind of cutting practice, the invasive species in the understory need to be dealt with, or afterwards, it'll just be 100 times worse. And it'll get worse a lot faster than it has probably over the last decade or so that you've been paying attention. So I'm going to kind of open myself up here. So this is our farm in Morrow County. And as emerald ash borer moved into the state, you know, I came home one evening as we were working on some management fact sheets and said, okay, I'm going to do some plots. Like I said earlier, I knew we had a lot of ash. I didn't know just how much ash we had. Most of it was concentrated in this area. In fact, this area down here in the southern part was almost 100% ash, but it over this swath, it probably averaged about 60%. And then what else did I have? So the ash are going to die. So what's left? Well, what was left wasn't a whole lot of good to work with. While I've got walnut listed there, most of it has nectaria canker on it. So it's not going to be a high dollar value walnut tree that comes out of there. We got a couple that aren't as badly infected, but most of ours have nectaria canker of some shape or form. Bitternut hickory is great, but it's a very slow grower, and it just depends, does it meet those needs? And we all know that the elm are going to grow up to some size and then die. I've got some huge cottonwood trees. They're usually the ones that get hit in the thunderstorms with the lightning. So this is what the bottom area of that little swath I highlighted looked like before we did a harvest. And so you can see here, I mean, it was ash, 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 ash. It was just tremendous. It was kind of daunting when I really started to realize what we were looking at species wise. So management wise, what do you do? Well, some of us, I looked at it and I said, let's try to get the big ones out and try hopefully to get 10 to 15 years worth of growth on the younger ones before emerald ash borer gets here. So we did take out about 130 trees and opened up the stand for those other trees to have room to grow. I also had to deal with grapevines because I knew that when we opened it, those were going to explode if I didn't deal with them first. We didn't have a lot of invasive species that were prominent other than multiflora rose. And so I did have to deal with that as well. Did I make it 10 years? Not quite. But in the interim, where we took out and I had some of these younger ash and had little open spots, I actually came in and planted some other tree species to try to change that diversity pattern that you looked at, because there just wasn't much there to work with. There wasn't a lot there that was great for wildlife habitat. And I knew that it needed a boost of some sort. How successful was I going to be? You never know. We did a lot of different things. These blue tubes all had young tree seedlings in them. I will tell you that the deer did not like the blue tubes and they just yanked them out of the ground. Didn't really gnaw on the seedlings, which was kind of unusual, but they did not like, and you could see their teeth marks where they had grabbed a hold and yanked stake and all out of the ground. And then I'd go down in the woods and these tubes would just be laying everywhere. So I gave up on the tree tubes. I did do some seed, not from this particular planting machine, but you can collect some seed and it just needs to go about an inch into the ground. Realize that the wildlife are going to find it as well. So you need to think about being a little bit heavy on the seed. But I had the most success with seed because you can put a lot in and it establishes its own root system. No matter what you're trying to plant in a woods, you're trying to plant around an existing root system. That means when you plant, you can't always close the soil around the roots that you've just put in the ground, and they tend to dry out before they get a really good chance to grow. Containers, I did do some containers. What I tried to do with some of the container trees was I planted them in the middle of the tops that from the timber sale in 2008 so that the deer couldn't get to them. There's a few that made it. I probably had the worst success with the bare root seedlings because I just couldn't get the soil packed around those roots, and they just ended up drying out and dying. There's a list of what I planted. As I said, survival was so-so. And I was really proud of this American chestnut. I had bought some seedlings and I did get them started and they grew well. But I was out there with them just a couple days ago and they already have chestnut blight on them. So they grew, but they're not going to be alive for very long. So, when we really started looking at some aerials, you can see all the dead ash that are hanging out here in the woods in the canopy. And this was 2015. So we, 7 years after the harvest, I knew we weren't going to make it to 10. Missed my mark, I guess. So we did another timber sale in 2017. And you have to think about it from our management perspective. We have hunters in the woods, we recreate in the woods, and all these standing dead ash trees were going to be a huge hazard for folks. So we marked 679 total trees for the sale. 636 were ash. We tried to salvage whatever we could that had some timber value to it, knowing that there were still going to be plenty of ash. I mean, when I walked out through the woods over the weekend, I'm amazed at how many standing dead ash are still out there. And once they get to about 4 or 5 years standing dead, they become huge hazards because they can snap without any cause. And it's just not something that I'd want to have standing in areas where folks are going to be for any length of time. My deer hunters, a couple of them had their deer stands in ash trees. And even though the trees had died, they were still, and I'm like, guys, find another tree. I don't want you to climb up into the stand and have the tree keel over. So management wise, it was a tough one because that's cutting a lot more trees than I wanted to do. But the flip side of it was having a woods, it was a hazard to even walk into. And it still has sections that are like that, but it was like, we might as well get them out as much as we can because there were going to be plenty left. We didn't take all of them by any stretch of the imagination. Some of them, the consultant that I worked with, we kind of looked at, these are what we call cull trees. They're up to the buyer whether they want to take them or not. Usually a forester, when you mark something like this, you're saying, I don't think there's much here, but if you think there's some value to taking the tree, it's yours, because they had a lot of decay. And for me, these two were actually right behind the house. And so another reason to try to move them out and not have to deal with the consequences. Hazards of ash, we talk about how often they break, and you can kind of see some of this here. I actually had one come down across the drive last Thursday night that I spent Friday morning cutting up so that I could get out and somebody could get in if they needed to. So that one didn't snap like some of these did. It actually snapped at the root system and came down in one fell swoop. But they snap in really odd places, which is why I say they're such a hazard. So as you're thinking about your woodland, I don't really typically worry about things like dead elm. Elms seem to stand forever. There's a lot of other species that once they die, they don't really snap and break like ash do. Ash, like I said, within that 4 to 5 year period, they become super hazardous, and you need to be aware of that as you're looking at your woods and trying to figure out what you want to do. That's what you're dealing with if you've got those kind of ash. And you have to think about it that if you're managing for timber, do you want this tree to snap and snap off some valuable timber species or valuable wildlife species? So it's not just an ash issue. It can be an issue with what else you're trying to grow in the woods. So after our sale, and after, I can't really say after EAB, because I think I still have a few living ash, but lots of open spaces, and this is where the invasive species come in. Full sun, birds perch and leave you all sorts of seed sources, both good and bad. And you need to pay attention to them, because you're not going to grow trees well, or the species probably that you want to grow, if you have this influx of non-native invasive plants. Lots of young stuff. This was actually, I just took this, it's about that same spot just this past weekend. So you can see there's stuff that's coming up. There's stuff that's working its way through. We have a lot of maple, a lot of sugar maple, a little bit of red. I planted in an area here a riparian buffer that has some tulip in it, has a few different species of oaks, and I'm starting to see some of the seed from those fill in some of these gaps, which is a good thing. But again, you're going to need to monitor it, because if you're going to manage this stand for the future, you need to be able to pick and choose which of those species you want to work with, which of them help you meet your goals and objectives, and thin out around them. Try to keep the invasive plants from hindering their growth to get up to a stand that you want to work with. Kind of another shot through the woods behind the house. There's a lot of floor vegetation here that's coming in before some of the trees are coming in. But you can see I've got some pin cherry sitting here and some elm. I don't mind the pin cherry. The elm, I know, are never really going to amount to much. So it's kind of one of those, okay, it's filling the site and probably closing in the canopy, but not necessarily helping me with my end goals and objectives. So I do try to knock them out where I feel like I'm not opening up the canopy too much, that I can knock it out, let it stand dead, and let the wildlife use it as a tree to roost in or whatever else they may need. So you had this sale, or you've had emerald ash borer go through. It's time to do another walkthrough. You may have known what you had before emerald ash borer hit. Now you really need to know what's left, what's coming in, what's in that understory. Do you need to plant? Like I said, I tried a bunch of different methods. If I was going to choose just one, I'd go back to using seed. If you feel like you've got an area that just doesn't have the diversity, or you also need to look at, okay, so I have this huge canopy gap from whatever reason, whether you cut trees, you had a storm that came through, whatever caused that canopy gap, what's around it seed-wise that can come in and maybe fill in the gap. So maybe you don't have to plant. My planting choice was done because of the species mix that was in the bottom of our woodland. Majority of the time, I would not recommend planting because it's just so difficult to do it under canopy, not out in a field where you can convert, but under canopy, there's just a lot of issues that can be created. But all of it needs to kind of flow along with those goals and objectives. Do I need to plant? Do I wait? It's just like when landowners remove invasive species, they'll say to me, so what do I go in and plant? I'm like, well, maybe you wait a year or two and see what comes in on its own. See what Mother Nature does about a seed source that comes in, you know, and if it looks like you're not going to get more native vegetation, you're going to be dealing with more invasive stuff, then you think about doing some planting or doing some other things. But it's all about the goals and objectives that line that path that you should be thinking about. You know, if I do this, what does it do? How does it help? You know, or if I just leave it go. And sometimes I think we're really eager to step in. But I've also seen in the bottom area where I did do some planting, the bitternut hickory have come in hot and heavy. And I would not have expected that because my bitternut hickory trees are quite a distance from those gaps. But apparently the squirrels and other things took them down there, buried them, and forgot what they did with them, which is okay. So waiting isn't always a bad thing, but you still have to monitor. And all of it, no matter whether you're dealing with ash or, you know, whatever you're trying to accomplish, think about this in the form of crop trees. So you can have crop trees that are good wildlife trees. You can have crop trees that provide timber products. You can have crop trees like sugar maple for a sugar bush. So species, you pick that species that helps you meet your goals. And then those are the trees that you spend your time and energy working around to help them be healthy and grow at the best rate that they can. So it might mean that you're thinning out some other competitors that don't necessarily meet your goals and objectives, but this particular tree does, so I'm going to give it more room to grow. And sometimes it has to be, some of those invasive species have to come out because they're competing for moisture. So we talk about crop trees a lot with other trees as they interfere with the canopy and you're trying to open up that canopy. But invasive species in the understory impact these trees when we hit drought years because you get just a little bit of moisture, and most of our invasive plants are very shallow rooted, so they get all the moisture and the trees suffer. So as we look at some of the research that comes out of woodlands that have been studied, is that those trees are just so adversely impacted by this solid carpet of invasive species as we go through drought years. I mean, it just stunts their growth. So you need to think about it in that context as well. Most of our native trees and shrubs that are in the understory, we don't have that issue with. It's the fact that these non-natives can create these carpets of root systems that just suck up everything, and the trees get little in those years when we're very dry. So you always have to remember that you're trying to release them from competition, but don't get slap happy and open them up too much. You'll end up with an understock stand that might cause the trees you're trying to favor to windthrow, or for some species create epicormic branches up and down the stem that devalues the tree if you're trying to look at it from a timber perspective. So there's always a pro and a con. You have to kind of think about that. If you're thinking about crop trees, in this instance, this is also on the Mansfield campus where we have a demonstration plot that folks can take a look at. So we made this cherry tree a crop tree. And then you can see back here, the pink flag tree was one that we decided had to come out to give this cherry more room to grow. And there's a double girdle there to knock it out of the stand. And just so, let's do. So a lot of times a single girdle will work fine. For some folks, they do the double girdle just to be sure. There are some trees that if you're not going to use chemical, you want to do double girdles on. But if you're going to use a chemical, you can probably get away most of the time with just a single chainsaw girdle here. As you see, Gabe put on some Garlon 4. There is a fact sheet on our Woodland Stewards website in the Ohio line system on crop tree management, which kind of walks you through what we just talked about, is how you choose your crop trees, how they help you meet your goals and objectives, and then how you thin out around them. The demo site that we have at the Mansfield campus has a control, so you can kind of see what we started with. And then on one side, we did a 4-sided release, which means around our crop tree, we removed the competition on all 4 sides. And then we have a 2-sided release where we just took the trees off of 2 sides of that canopy to try to open it up. My experience one-on-one with woodland owners is that they're a little more comfortable with the 2-sided and maybe come back in 5 or 6 years and take out the other side, the other 2 sides. But you're welcome. It's along the trail on campus, and anybody's welcome to take a look. For most of us, I talked a little bit about the epicormic branching. I'm not going to spend time on stocking charts and all of that good stuff, but realize that there are these charts that foresters use to help us understand if we're in that fully stocked stage, which is where we want to be. Because when we're overstocked, it means that we've got too many trees on the site using the same amount of resources, and understocked means that that site will support more trees. It doesn't have enough trees to grow to the full potential. And so there's things that we need to think about, and you can easily get understocked if you start getting chainsaw happy, which I have seen some landowners do. And there's not a whole lot you can do but wait for the stand to regenerate. So we saw this earlier, and now when I updated this for tonight's talk, I had just a few of these marked. I had these 4. And I now have burning bush coming up in the woods. I found some small plants over the weekend. So it's a good idea to walk occasionally. And right now, burning bush stands out because of those bark flanges on it and the red leaves. Now's the time to identify them and mark them, and either go after them now or go after them this winter before we get to spring. So I have some work to do. This is a picture of an understory that is solid burning bush. And in Southwest Ohio, most of the foresters are telling me that as they remove honeysuckle, burning bush is coming in just as thick as the honeysuckle did. And so all of this impacts the health and your goals for your woodland. There's just no way that you can have this dense population in the understory and not impact the overall health of the forest. What I always worried about with bush honeysuckle was that landowners had a layer of honeysuckle underneath and then a stand of trees that would gradually lose their vigor due to the competition. And once you get honeysuckle and big trees with no regeneration, as the trees fall out, you're left with a field of honeysuckle. And I can see that happening again with burning bush. Know that some of these plants have the potential to change your soil chemistry. So buckthorn is one of those that changes the pH. Kudzu is another one that changes the pH, and so is oriental bittersweet. We know that the honeysuckles leave some allelopathic chemicals behind that can impact regrowth of native stuff. But those that change the pH and the characteristics of the soil, what I find in working with metro parks is you can't go back in and plant what was there prior to the invasive plants. And some of your trees are not going to regenerate like they normally would because the pH is different. And so it no longer matches what was there before, and you may have to look at some other species. So another good reason to get ahead of it and not leave it there in the understory for a while, because no matter what you're managing for, be that timber wildlife, whatever. The wildlife are going to spread these things, whether they're good food source for them or not. And you're just going to have to notice them, hopefully early, and start on them early before they become a solid path underneath. So there is a fact sheet at our Woodland Stewards website that is an older fact sheet that is on my to-do list to update. It needs a bad update, and I'll get there eventually. So, but it talks about all of these timber stand improvement practices, the frilling and the girdling we just saw with the chainsaw. Some other things, foliar treatments for some of these plants. So there's a recommendation for bush honeysuckle as a foliar treatment this time of year. After we've had a hard frost and the native vegetation dies down, you can go after the foliage of honeysuckle because it's still pulling in nutrients, and hit it with something like a glyphosate product that will hit it, stick to it, and go down and kill the roots. But foliar applications are tough. I don't recommend them in every situation because you have the potential to hit those tree seedlings that you're trying to release to grow into your future forest. So it always depends on the plant. We did some autumn olive spraying here. So if you look at these plants, one of the things you'll notice, and it's pretty consistent with all of our non-natives, is they have kind of a glossy coat to them. And so if you're going to spray foliar, you want to use something that helps it stick to the leaves. So what you spray sticks to the plant's leaves, doesn't roll off and create some other issues. So some type of surfactant, there's a bunch of different ones out there you can access. If you're looking at killing something like this, a small tree, maybe some multi-stem shrubs, you can do a basal bark spray where you treat all the way around the stem, that lower 12 to 18 inches on something that's got a smooth bark. The rougher the bark, the less effective this treatment is. And this is one of those treatments that needs to be carried in an oil or some sort. Methylated seed oil is probably the greenest option there on that list. And the caution I will add is that if you pick up a chemical that needs to be mixed in oil, you need to look at the label because some of them used to list diesel fuel, kerosene, fuel oil, I mean, all sorts of different things. A lot of them now have narrowed it down to one or two options. And so pay attention to the labels and mix appropriately. And my pesticide applicator hat says, the label is the law, so please read the label before you go mixing and spraying things. We can do cut stumps. Sometimes on the multi-stemmed ones, this is a little difficult when you're talking some of the shrubs, but if you're trying to eliminate young trees from around some of your crop trees, this may be a way to do that, to drop them and then treat that cut stump. So if you're going to use something that's water carried, you usually can just hit this fresh cut surface. If the weather isn't great and you're going to cut today, but you don't feel like you should spray a chemical, then you need something that's carried in an oil and you can come back later and spray and cover this entire stump along with this surface with an oil carried herbicide that will penetrate the bark and kill. So you've got some options. Always use what you are comfortable with. Someone may tell you that such and such chemical is a great thing to use. If you're not real chemical savvy or you don't feel comfortable mixing and using some things, stick with where your comfort zone is, because if you try to step out of that comfort zone sometime with chemicals, the consequences aren't the best. And we did these, you can just kind of see quick. Cut it off and then treat. Goodbye, autumn olive. For some species, like this stand of honeysuckle that's under this young forest, you may want to do 2 steps where you come in and you cut all the honeysuckle off. And then when it resprouts, you come back and treat. That allows you to use less chemical and more targeted applications. If you're not going to use chemical, then you're going to have to come back in and cut and cut and cut until you outlive the plant's resources. So keep that in mind. But I kind of like the 2-step, because if you think about it, you're going to spray this outer area, and when it dies, you're going to have to move in and spray the next area. Or if you go in and you cut patches of it off and then come back and spray, less chemical, less issues with spray drift and things like that. You can be much more targeted. There are some other methods for some trees. There's the old hack and squirt. This is actually one of my old forestry professors, Bill Cowan, who had a long career as Ohio State's extension forester. And this little piece of equipment is called a Jim Jam. You put the chemical in the tube, you jam it into the root crown and pull up on the handle, and it releases a measured amount of chemical into the tree. Heavy tool to carry around the woods. Not something that you can easily get your hands on anymore. Most of us, if we're going to do hack and squirt, we're going to use a nice little hatchet and make these marks around the tree to a certain depth, and then squirt herbicide in those hack marks. It's a much easier method. And I always say, you know, if you sit down your hatchet and then you can't figure out where you left it, it's a whole lot cheaper to replace the hatchet than it is to replace a $400 or $500 piece of equipment that you've been hauling through the woods. So a hatchet and a squirt bottle does just as well as some of the fancier pieces of equipment. We'd also have a fact sheet that, so let's say you're not just doing invasive species, you're knocking out elm, you're knocking out ironwood or musclewood, trying to get it out of the woods. We have this fact sheet that talks about the relative effectiveness of some of our more common forestry herbicides. So it can make some recommendations for you depending on the plant and what chemical you want to use and what method you want to use. While this shows an 02 version, it's been updated by Dave Kraus and just needs to be reloaded to the site. He didn't make any changes. So what you see when you find this one on our Woodland Stewards website will be the same once we get it updated to the system. So we started the evening with this, thinking about woodland management and all the things that it entails. You know, grapevine removal, weed tree. I didn't use that word before, but weed tree for tree species that are growing in the woods, taking up growing space, and aren't contributing to your ultimate goals and objectives. Those are the ones that you're probably going to use some of those practices we just looked at on to remove them as competition. But use your time well. So if you look at the crop tree system, it's one of the reasons why I really like working with woodland owners with that system, is that you can kind of picture, you know, I want to manage for wild turkey. Well, one of the things we know wild turkey like are acorns as part of their diet. So when I go through my woods, I'm going to highlight the oak trees. The oak trees are great for other wildlife, and they're also pretty valuable timber trees. So I can hit maybe multiples of my management, my ownership objectives by maybe flagging. I always recommend landowners, you can paint them if you want, but the nice thing with flagging is if you change your mind, you just pull the flagging off the tree. So you kind of go through and you pick your crop trees and you walk around them. You think about, oh, there's some vines here I need to deal with. There's some invasive species here that if I take out a couple of competing trees over here are just going to explode. So let's deal with those first before we thin some of the other trees out. So it's a process. And what I like about crop tree is that you are focusing your time and efforts. You're not just going through the woods, killing every ironwood tree that's in the woods. There's no sense in that. Kill them where they're competing with something that you don't like or doesn't help you meet your goals and objectives. I always say beauty's in the eye of the beholder when it comes to weed trees. So what may be one person's weed tree is someone else's favorite tree. Usually Buckeye is the one that creates some of those issues. Some folks look at them as weed trees, and then some folks, they're the revered Ohio State alumni Buckeye tree. And so all of that plays into how you manage your woodland. And I said at the beginning, you see it here at the end. There's professional foresters out there. There's actually in process, and I think maybe I'm thinking December 1st, the new version will be up, but there actually is a directory out there that is supported by the Ohio chapter of the Society of American Foresters that can give you a list of consulting foresters. You can check them out. You can talk to them. We've got them fairly well scattered now out across the state, and they can help with a lot of these things. There's also the Division of Forestry that has the service foresters who can walk the woods with you, help you identify some things, and maybe help you focus what you're trying to accomplish, and maybe make some suggestions on what things you can look at. There's a lot of other things you can do with your woods. Some folks talk about leasing their woods for hunting. There's folks that do maple syrup. Know that if you've got a lot of maples and you think you might want to investigate that, today's maple syrup operations are a lot different than they have been in the past. You can start with something as simple as finding someone to lease taps. So they're paying you to lease however many taps go out into your woods, all the way up to investing in equipment and building a sugar house and making your own syrup. So you've got a lot of different options when it comes to some of those non-timber forest products if you're not really thinking about managing for timber. But the bottom line is that no matter what you're managing your woods for, the invasive species have to be dealt with. It's no longer oh yeah, I'll get to those. It's if you don't get to it, it's going to take over that understory, and you'd rather have you start working on it when it's a plant that you can pull here and a plant that you can pull there, versus you're standing at the edge of your woods and everything you're seeing in the understory is an invasive plant. You just don't know where to start and you feel overwhelmed. There are some vendors out there that can help with some of this stuff. So that's where working with either a consulting forester or one of the service foresters out of the State Division of Forestry can make some recommendations, can hook you up with some vendors. There are some cost share programs out there available for woodland owners to help them do some of this work. And so that's another reason to make that contact. See if there's some dollars out there that can help with this process. So here's a little test. I took this Saturday. You see all that dead weeds in front of you? That's all garlic mustard, which when I look on the ground, looks like this right now. But all that standing dead weeds are full of about 100 seeds per plant. And when you walk through it, you'll hear them all spring out of the seed pods and land on the ground. So it's a biennial plant. I've got plenty of it. This is one of those spots that I highlighted I need to go back to because all those standing dead plants is not a good sign. So one of the areas that's on my, okay, Kath, you got to go do that this winter. Getting to know your woods, however you want to do that, but understand a little bit about what you have, because when the forester or somebody comes to work with you, they're going to ask you a bunch of questions, and the more knowledge you have, the better that conversation will probably go. What are the issues? What do you want? What are those goals and objectives? How do you get there? The forester can help you with that. The undesirables, whatever that may be, native stuff, non-native stuff, that's what all of us are here for. That's why you're here tonight, to learn some things, I hope. But there's plenty of professionals out there that you can also work with. I'm trying to think, the new directory website will be OSAF, and we can put it in the chat or someplace here because I don't think I have it in the PowerPoint. OSAFdirectory.com, I believe it is. There is an old version up now, but there'll be a new version here in about a month. I just looked at it this morning with a conference call. It has a lot of the foresters that are listed. They're licensed, they're certified. They take a code of ethics as being a member of the Society of American Foresters. Doesn't mean you can't have some folks that have issues, but it's a great place to start to get assistance if you don't want to go straight to like the service foresters. But you can get that link as well at the same site if you want to look at the state foresters with the Division of Forestry. And always ask questions. Don't hesitate to ask questions. That's what we're here for. You can pester Carrie, and Carrie knows where to find me, or you can come to me direct, however you want to do that. Our Woodland Stewards website has a lot of the fact sheets. That's where our webinars are located right now. We're trying to put together some online classes that will probably hit about January. So there's plenty of resources out there. Ask, and we'll do our best to help you. And with that, there's our Woodland Stewards website, my email contact. And, you know, if you've got Carrie's contact, like I said, she knows where to find me. So that works just as well. And with that,
we have a few questions, Kathy. I don't know if you want me to read them to you or if you want to scan through them. They're in the Q&A.
Why don't you start with reading them and
okay. We had one, and I don't think you covered pawpaws, but someone's asking if they're a good tree to plant in their woodland.
So pawpaws require at least 2 trees. I have one pawpaw planted here behind the house, and it's starting to root sucker out through the woods. But it's not going to produce fruit because I don't have a second tree. And I realized that the other day that, you know, in my mind on my to-do list was to add a second tree because I did have 2 to start with and 1 died. So they have their place. They're a little bit of an understory plant, even though I know pawpaw growers are growing them out in full sun. Their native habitat is a little bit of shade. They're a little bit of an understory. So try to give them some protection, and they're okay. They're going to root sucker. So you're not going to just have 2 trees. You're going to have these trees root sucker out through the woods. And so just beware of that.
All right, next one. They say I have a lot of woolly leaf galls in my house plants that I brought in for the winter from the oak tree. Will those wasps hatch in her house?
So if they're on the leaves, most of the leaf ones should have already hatched. But it's worth cutting a few of them open to see whether there's still live critters in there, because yes, the conditions inside, not knowing exactly which ones we're talking about, but the conditions inside, it's like, you know, bringing a plant in that has a praying mantis egg mass on it, and then your house within a week is full of little praying mantises. So I would cut a few of them open to see if they still have live insects inside of them. And if they do, or eggs inside of them, then yes, you need to be concerned that they're going to hatch in the house.
All right, next question. They have 2 old growth white oaks in their backyard, and they remove the leaves every fall. And they're wondering if this is going to hurt the long-term health of the tree by removing those nutrients that could be provided to it.
So that's always a tough one. I'm a fan of mulching up the leaves and leaving them on the yard, unless they're, you know, going to create a great mass to kill the grass off. But most of the time, if you can mulch them and leave them, everything would benefit from those nutrients if you can. I don't know how I did it, but the way we built the house, I don't have to deal with leaves. They all flush out of the yard and out into the crop field in front of the house. So leaves are not an issue for me. But if you can mulch them up and leave them, I think in the long run, you'll be better off.
You kind of covered this, but they wondered what do we replace invasives with, and I was kind of wondering that too. I mean, I know we put trees in there, you said, but like, what if we wanted to add some shrubs in there? And you said like
So
it would alter the pH. Could we maybe add blueberries in there? I know they like full sun.
So if you're dealing, so if it was honeysuckle isn't as much of a pH changer as it leaves some allelopathic chemicals behind. And so what I have seen is that, you know, you plant things and they don't grow as well as you would think they would. So there's definitely some chemical left behind in the soil once you remove the honeysuckle that can inhibit growth. I haven't seen it really kill things, but I have seen it kind of stunt the growth of stuff. So just, you can plant. Always when you're going to go back in and plant, think about where you're planting, how much sunlight is hitting the forest floor. Because if it's not a lot of sunlight, then the shrubs or whatever you plant back in has to be able to tolerate that small amount of sunlight. So match the plant to the amount of sunlight that's making it through the canopy.
This is on all floral rose. Should they hand dig it or should they spray it?
I prefer to spray it because a lot of times hand digging, you're going to leave some root system behind and it's going to resprout. But that's not that you can't. Just realize that it's probably not a one and done kind of thing if you're going to dig it. You just have to be conscious of and monitor. Okay, I dug it out of here. Is it gone? Watch it for a few years. And maybe at that point you could just spray the resprouts instead of having to continue to dig. Just depends on how big, because I have to say some of those root masses on multiflora rose can be huge. I've also had folks burn it if they're doing some kind of, depending on where it is. And then when it sprouts back, they hit it because it's a smaller plant at that point. But I don't recommend burning in the woods unless you know what you're doing. That can be a bad scene.
Next question is, they have a thick stand of buckthorn. They let it grow as a barrier between their property and an offensive neighbor. What might they replace the buckthorn with? It needs to screen the area from the ground up to at least 10 feet tall and not be bird friendly. They need to keep their fowl away from this person's property.
So the buckthorn is going to have changed the pH of the soil. So I'd start with a soil test to see where your pH is. And then, wow. You could look at some conifers, depending on what else you've got around. There's not a lot of shrubs that you're going to plant that aren't going to have some sort of food source, some berry or something that the birds are going to eat. So you can go towards the conifer side and see if you can get, something like an arborvitae or an eastern red cedar or something that can be dense. May not stay that short unless you buy some type of cultivar. But I'd start with a soil test to make certain you know what pH you're dealing with, because that can really dictate the plants that you even have as an option.
We have a question asking how deep that girdle was on your double girdle and your regular girdle cut.
So on trees that are diffuse porous, meaning that they've got multiple rings that move food and water up and down, you're going to need to go deeper because you need to sever all of those tissues, all of those vessels. It can be 1.5 inches depending on the size of the tree. If it's a ring porous tree like the ash that Gabe was actually girdling, you can probably go in about 1 inch and you're going to be fine. So it depends on the tree species. And it depends on if you're going to use chemical, because you can get away with maybe a little less depth if you're going to then spray that fresh cut so that it can go in and kill the tree. But I've got plenty of images where the tree was girdled and then you come back a few years later and it's just got a bump where it grew over and kept on growing. So you don't want to have to do it twice.
What are your thoughts regarding the American Chestnut Foundation trying to reintroduce a blight-resistant chestnut tree?
It's taken a long time, and I always say tree research is a long-term investment. Even the elms that we're trying to use for Dutch elm disease resistant have now been out for a while, and some of them are showing other issues. Chestnut has taken a long time to try to get to a blight resistant tree. I think they're doing some amazing research. I just don't know if we're going to get there. It seems like no matter what crosses they're using, they're creating trees that are more resistant but aren't completely resistant. And so we may never get to something that is totally resistant. We're going to have somebody from the American Chestnut Foundation talk at our Woodland Water and Wildlife Conference in March to talk about some of their research.
I've had two folks ask about the management of Japanese stiltgrass and tree of heaven.
So Japanese stiltgrass, you're going to have to spray it. I mean, there's just, and we do have a fact sheet on controlling Japanese stiltgrass. I mean, if it's someplace where you continuously mow, you might be able to keep it under control, but realize that Japanese stiltgrass is one of the big reasons why the Forest Service put wash pads in for all their loggers. So if you're in one wood section, when you go to move to the next one, you have to take all of your equipment through a wash pad because they were carrying stiltgrass all over the national forests. And it can become pretty dense. So there is a fact sheet on the Woodland Stewards website on control options for Japanese stiltgrass. It is one that we need to deal with.
Is mineral oil a good carrier for herbicides?
You need to look at the labels to see if it's something that is going to be allowed as a carrier. Some of them will say some of those different options, but a lot of times they're very specific. And that's one thing. They used to be much more general. And what I'm seeing in the last decade is labels are getting a lot more specific. You know, instead of all these options, you've got one or two.
Is serviceberry a good replacement? They say for honeysuckle, yeah. But is it? Okay.
Yeah. Awesome. And it's great for birds.
How best can I get rid of English ivy and vine honeysuckle that has taken over large parts of an older woods?
We don't have a fact sheet on either one of those. There's some great sources out there. It's going to have to be a foliar treatment for both of them because there are just so many small vines that there's no easy way to cut a vine and treat it that small. And so it's a case of you're going to have to go at it from a foliar standpoint, and you're going to have to use, especially on the ivy, you're going to have to use a surfactant so that the chemical adheres to the leaves.
Somebody did a massive honeysuckle removal a few years ago, and now snake root has dominated that. Is that normal? And do you have any suggestions of how to control it?
I don't know that I've ever had to control snake root. You know, it's all about what seed source was around. And apparently snake root was that plant. Doesn't mean that it's a bad thing, but if it's not what you want, then yeah, you're going to have to deal with it. You're going to have to either pull it, which for snake root isn't easy. or hit it with something that will knock it out.
What would be the reason that their NRCS brush management plan would call for removal of spice bush? I don't see it listed anywhere as an invasive species.
It's not an invasive species. This is one of my headaches. So some of the foresters are calling spice bush invasive because it can be aggressive. So it's not invasive. I mean, it's not a non-native, it's a native plant. And if it's something that you want to keep and encourage, you should. I just know that I've had some conversations the last few years with some of the foresters that they keep saying it's invasive. And I'm like, it's not invasive, it's aggressive. It can be an aggressive plant in the right or wrong spot. So if they've put it in the plan, they must have felt like it was too much in the site. I mean, I think that you can argue that maybe you thin it out instead of removing all of it. It's just got so many benefits to it. I hate to see the terminology used with it as an invasive.
Tree of Heaven, controlling Tree of Heaven.
So we do have a fact sheet on the website on control options for Tree of Heaven. One of the things I will say is don't girdle it, because 1,000 of that poor tree's relatives are going to show up in the stand. So you got rid of one, but you gained 1,000 more. So there are some options to kill it and do it effectively. And so I would grab the fact sheet so you can see what your options are. It's a tough one to work with. It's a tough one to kill. And also beware that the sap from Ailanthus or Tree of Heaven, if you inundate your skin with it, you can end up with some heart attack-like symptoms. So when you're working with Ailanthus or Tree of Heaven, be careful about open wounds and sap and all that good stuff. Keep an eye out.
When you were talking about elms that were filling in the canopy, what did you mean by knock out to leave them dead standing?
So I'm in some spots, I'm going to go in and girdle them and leave them standing dead. So the wildlife can use them, because the reality is the elm are not going to reach maturity. With Dutch elm disease, they're going to be knocked out of the canopy at some point in time and become another dead tree that you have to deal with in the stand. So in some places where the elm is really heavy, I'm going in and taking them out before they, get to that stage. So I'm trying to be a little preemptive about having more standing dead trees than I need to have.
We got time for one last question. And someone asked, when you clear plants or shrubs or trees from around a tree you want to help, how far out do you clear that?
So when we're talking crop tree management, you look up at the crown of the tree that you're trying to help, and you look out on that far edge of the crown, and the trees that are interfering with the crown, so they're kind of intermingled twigs, those are the ones that are interfering with the growth, and those are the ones that you want to think about thinning out. Most of the stuff that is growing underneath that canopy really isn't impacting the tree, other than when we're talking about the non-native invasive plants being so thick. And so for releasing the tree from the crop tree standpoint, it's about looking at the crown. And when you look up at the crown, you want to kind of divide it into 4 sections and figure out, which tree's on which side. And as I said, you can take out 2 sides and open up the crown just on 2 sides, or if you want to do all 4, you can do that as well.
Excellent. Well, Kathy, this was a great discussion tonight and great topic. And I want to thank everybody that joined in. Sorry for the technical difficulty at the beginning. And I didn't introduce myself, but I'm Carrie Jagger, and I'm the Ag and Natural Resources Educator in Morrow County. And I set this up for folks in my county, but then I extended the invitation out to everyone in the state, and Kathy did as well. So We were really excited with the turnout, and I hope everybody took something away from this. So everybody have a good night, and thank you for joining in.